Karen slaps nurse for ignoring her in emergency room, didn't know the nurse was treating a child. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights above hummed in a rhythmic pulse, filling the air with a soft, artificial buzz that contrasted sharply with the chaotic scene unfolding in the emergency room. It was a typical Monday evening in the hospital, the kind where the hallways were filled with the constant shuffle of nurses, doctors, and the urgent beeping of monitors. A trauma case had just arrived, and the emergency room was in the midst of controlled chaos. The patients in the waiting area, some clutching wounds or sporting grim expressions, were resigned to the fact that they were going to have to wait, an inevitability of an overburdened healthcare system. Yet, amidst all this, there was one individual who refused to let the sense of urgency around her diminish her belief that her issue was the most important. That person was Karen. Karen strutted into the ER with an air of entitlement that seemed to fill the room. She wore a brand new pair of white sneakers that squeaked loudly on the tiled floor, making her steps even more noticeable as she walked through the doors. Her face was contorted in an exaggerated wince, her hand clutching her right foot, which she kept raised as though it were an emergency in itself. To anyone observing her, she appeared like someone who might have just received life-altering news or suffered a terrible accident, but in reality, it was just a stubbed toe. Yet, to Karen, this stubbed toe was no minor injury. It was the kind of injury that, if not attended to immediately, would disrupt the entire fabric of her existence. "Excuse me. Excuse me. Someone, please, help me," she bellowed, her voice slicing through the general hum of the ER. It wasn't a request, it was a command, loud enough for the entire waiting area to turn in her direction. The nurse nearest to her, a seasoned ER professional named Rachel, looked up for a brief moment before continuing to scan the monitor in front of her. She had no time to indulge Karen's apparent crisis. The trauma team had just rushed in with a child who had suffered significant injuries from a car accident, and the priority needed to shift to the child who was on the brink of death. Rachel's hand moved instinctively toward the child's bed as she prepared to assess their vitals, the urgency of the situation pressing against her chest. But Karen, oblivious to the life and death situation playing out just down the hallway, continued her one-woman spectacle. "I can't believe this. Do you people have any idea how painful this is?" Karen continued, her voice growing louder with each syllable. She hadn't even noticed the nurse slip past her, heading toward the trauma bay where doctors were already beginning to assess the child. Karen, however, was still standing near the entrance, writhing in exaggerated agony. She had been in pain before, plenty of times. In fact, she had stubbed her toe more than once in the past and walked it off without much drama. But tonight was different. She had managed to make her way to the ER and wasn't about to be ignored. The sheer thought of waiting, of not being the center of attention, was enough to drive her mad. "Hello? Nurse," she called again, louder this time, hands now firmly gripping the edge of a nearby chair as though she were clinging to her last bit of dignity. Rachel, who was still attending to the trauma patient, turned her head slightly toward the hallway but didn't respond. She knew Karen's type, people who thought that because they were in pain, their case was the only one that mattered. It wasn't her first time dealing with patients like Karen. But she also knew that there was a hierarchy in the ER, one that was built on severity of cases, and right now, the child in critical condition deserved her attention far more than someone who had simply stubbed their toe. "Is anyone going to help me, or what?" Karen's voice had risen into a shrill demand. Rachel's patience was beginning to thin, but she kept her focus on the patient in front of her. As she checked the child's blood pressure, she noted the child's pale complexion, the shallow breaths, and the increasing tremor in their body as they fought to stay conscious. There was no time to deal with the woman in the waiting area. Not now. Not when she had a child in her hands, one whose life might slip away if she didn't act quickly. Karen, however, wasn't deterred by Rachel's apparent indifference. As the seconds dragged into what felt like hours, her frustration started to turn into anger. The longer she had to wait, the more she became convinced that she was being personally slighted. What kind of hospital was this, anyway? Why was she being ignored when her pain was clearly more important than whatever chaos was unfolding in the back rooms? Why are you people treating me like I'm invisible? Karen huffed, taking a few more exaggerated steps down the hall, her foot still raised. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't let it go. Her sense of entitlement had long since taken over her better judgment. When Rachel briefly glanced up from the trauma case, she met Karen's gaze for a fraction of a second before refocusing on the child. It was only that brief moment of eye contact that seemed to set Karen off. You! Yeah, you! Karen shouted, her voice cutting through the air. I've been standing here for 10 minutes. My toe is hurt. Why won't you help me? Rachel, still in full nurse mode, knew she had to keep calm. She had seen this type of situation unfold countless times before, people whose personal pain became their whole world and demanded attention. But there were bigger things at play. She needed to triage, she needed to manage critical situations. And Karen's stubbed toe, while uncomfortable, could wait. But it wasn't just the weight that was bothering Karen. It was the feeling of not being heard, of not being seen, of being pushed aside for someone else. Her stubbed toe felt worse with each passing second, and as her frustration mounted, so did her need for recognition. Excuse me. Karen barked again, this time louder than before. You can't just ignore me like this. Do your job. Rachel, who had been moving swiftly and efficiently through her tasks, didn't even acknowledge the outburst. But the damage was done. Karen had become more vocal, more demanding, and her patience was running out. The nurse's refusal to give her the attention she thought she deserved stoked a fire that Karen wasn't prepared to extinguish. And when Rachel moved past her once more, this time en route to grab equipment for a different patient, Karen snapped. It wasn't intentional at first. She simply reached out in a moment of rage, slapping the nurse on the arm as she walked by. It was a sharp, stinging motion, the kind of slap you'd give someone who had just cut in line or ignored you for too long. To Karen, it was a way of demanding respect, of forcing the nurse to acknowledge her. The slap echoed in the sterile air of the hallway, leaving behind a stunned silence for just a moment before the chaos of the emergency room resumed. The moment the slap echoed through the emergency room hallway, a hush fell over the area. For a brief second, everything seemed to slow down. Nurses and doctors, caught up in their hectic routines, glanced up, only to quickly avert their eyes, not wanting to get involved in whatever drama was unfolding. Rachel, the nurse who had been slapped, froze for a moment. She felt the sting of the blow but was too composed to show it. Years of working in the emergency room had taught her how to maintain professionalism in the face of chaos, and this situation was no different. She took a deep breath, forced herself to regain her composure, and focused on her primary responsibility, the child in critical condition in the trauma bay. But Karen wasn't done yet. Karen, on the other hand, stood there in stunned silence for a moment, watching as the nurse kept walking as if nothing had happened. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the adrenaline from her action coursing through her veins. She had expected something, anything, from Rachel. Maybe an apology, maybe a confrontation, but definitely something. Instead, the nurse acted as though Karen hadn't just slapped her. This lack of acknowledgement was more than Karen could handle. Excuse me. Did you just ignore me? Karen shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of indignation and disbelief. She stepped forward, her body tense, the pain in her toes suddenly forgotten in the heat of the moment. How dare this nurse walk away after being slapped? How could she be so disrespectful? This wasn't just about a stubbed toe anymore. It was about Karen's dignity, her sense of justice, and, above all, her need to be acknowledged. Rachel didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her steps were quick and deliberate, and she was already lost in her own world of trauma care. But Karen wasn't going to let this go. No, she had been wronged, and now the whole world needed to know it. She stepped into the nurse's path, blocking her way. I'm talking to you. Karen cried out again, her voice rising with every syllable. She didn't care who heard her, she was beyond the point of caring about anything but getting what she wanted. She was a customer, she thought, and hospitals were supposed to serve customers. Rachel finally stopped, her body language tense as she turned to face Karen. "Ma'am," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm sorry, but right now, I need to attend to more critical patients." She didn't apologize for being slapped. That was beneath her, and it wasn't worth her time to address. Karen, however, was not satisfied with that response. Her face flushed a deep red, and her hands trembled with the need to exert control over the situation. "Critical patients," she scoffed, throwing her hands up in the air in a gesture of mockery. "I'm a critical patient. Do you have any idea how bad my toe hurts? I could barely walk in here. And you just walked past me as if I'm nothing." Rachel's gaze flickered for a moment toward the trauma bay, where the child was being prepped for emergency surgery. The child's injuries were severe, and the team was working against the clock to save their life. Rachel's attention, her entire focus, was on that child. There was no time for petty arguments, no time to entertain Karen's complaints. She took a step back, moving toward the child's bed, but Karen wasn't finished. Before Rachel could take another step, Karen reached out and grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "I'm not done talking to you." Karen spat, her fingers digging into Rachel's sleeve. The physical contact was firm, perhaps even more forceful than the slap had been, and Karen's eyes burned with anger. "You don't get to treat me like this. You're going to pay for this, do you hear me? I want a manager, and I want you fired." Rachel, still composed, gently shook her arm free. Her patience was beginning to fray, but she kept her voice level. "Ma'am, I understand that you're in pain, but there are people here who need immediate medical attention. I'm asking you to calm down so I can continue to do my job." She was no longer apologizing. She wasn't going to engage with Karen's theatrics. Karen, now fully invested in her crusade, took another step forward, this time raising her voice so everyone in the ER could hear her. "This is unacceptable," she screamed, causing a few patients in the waiting area to turn and look. "I've been treated like garbage. I've been ignored, slapped, and now you're just walking away from me. You all need to do something about this." A few of the staff members in the ER began to take notice, but they didn't intervene right away. They had seen situations like this before, and they knew that Karen's anger wasn't going to subside quickly. What was more concerning to them was the fact that Rachel was still standing there, trying to remain calm while a crisis was happening elsewhere in the hospital. But Karen was relentless, not caring about the bigger picture. At that moment, one of the hospital security officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, appeared at the entrance of the ER hallway. His eyes scanned the situation, noting the raised voices, the tension in the air, and the fact that Rachel was now engaged in what appeared to be a heated exchange with Karen. "Everything okay here?" the security officer asked, his tone even and professional. Karen immediately latched onto the officer's presence, sensing an ally in her corner. "No, it's not okay," she practically shouted. "This nurse slapped me, and no one is doing anything about it. I demand that she be fired immediately. I want to speak to someone in charge." The security officer glanced at Rachel, then back at Karen. "Ma'am," he began, "I need you to step aside. If you're not feeling well, we can help you get the proper attention, but this behavior isn't going to be tolerated." His voice was calm but firm, and his eyes made it clear that he was not about to entertain Karen's tirade for much longer. But Karen wasn't about to back down. "I'll talk to whoever I need to talk to. I'm not leaving until I'm treated with the respect I deserve." "This is an outrage," she snapped, her voice full of venom. The security officer took a deep breath. "Ma'am, if you do not calm down, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Karen's face twisted in fury. She couldn't believe it. She was being told to leave, she, the injured party, the one who had been slapped. But as the reality of the situation set in, Karen's anger began to shift, moving from raw emotion to a more calculated fury. She would not go quietly. No, she would make sure everyone in the hospital knew how she had been wronged. But then, something happened that Karen didn't expect. The security officer, instead of listening to her demands, simply stepped forward and calmly placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. "That's it. You need to leave," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Karen, now realizing she was being escorted out, fought back with everything she had. She shoved her way out of the security officer's grasp, screaming and yelling about the injustice of it all, but it was clear that the staff and security were done with her. The last thing Karen saw as she was dragged out of the ER was Rachel, still standing tall, resolutely focused on the critical care that the child required. It was a reminder, whether Karen recognized it or not, that there were real problems to deal with in the world, and her stubbed toe was just a footnote in the chaos of life. As Karen was forcibly escorted out of the emergency room, her fury continued to boil over. She struggled against the security officer's firm grip, her feet dragging as she tried to gain some sense of control over the situation, but her attempts were futile. The officer's stance was unyielding, and no matter how much she yelled, how loudly she demanded that everyone pay attention to her plight, the situation continued to unfold in a way she had not anticipated. By the time she reached the exit, she had completely forgotten about the pain in her toe. Instead, all of her energy had been consumed by her outrage over what she perceived to be a massive injustice. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How could they treat her this way? How could she be dismissed in favor of some critical patient who probably wasn't even as important as she was? The questions rattled through her mind like an incessant drumbeat, each one making her feel more and more invisible, as though her very existence was being erased. Outside the hospital, the cool night air hit her face with an unexpected force. It was a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the emergency room, where the tension had felt palpable. As Karen stood there, breathing heavily, her mind swirled with thoughts of revenge. She didn't deserve to be treated like this. She had only come to the hospital because she needed help, because she had been in pain. Instead, she had been ignored, disrespected, and humiliated. How could this happen to her? Her hand still clutched at her injured toe, though the pain was no longer the focus of her attention. She couldn't help but feel like an affronted queen being cast aside by the very system that was supposed to serve her. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced around, as if seeking someone, anyone, who could confirm her belief that she had been wronged. But there was no one around who would back her up. The people passing by barely took notice of her distress. The city, as always, was indifferent. It wasn't long before her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her out of her spiraling thoughts. She fumbled with it, her fingers still trembling with frustration, and answered the call from her friend, Melissa. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, trying to sound normal, though her voice was still edged with anger. "Karen? What's going on?" "I heard you went to the ER," Melissa's voice crackled through the phone, filled with concern. "I went to the ER," Karen replied, her voice growing louder again, "because of my damn toe. And I was treated like crap. They ignored me. That nurse literally slapped me, and no one cared. I've been humiliated, and now I'm outside in the cold for no reason." Melissa was silent for a moment, taken aback by Karen's outburst. "Wait, a nurse slapped you? Are you sure about that? What happened exactly?" "I swear, Melissa, I'm not making it up. She walked past me, again, and I was in so much pain, I couldn't stand it. I tried to get her attention, but she just ignored me. Then, when I grabbed her arm, she had the nerve to tell me that other patients were more important. More important than me, than my pain. So, I slapped her. I slapped her for walking away. And you know what happened? They threw me out. I'm outside now, freezing and with no help for my toe." Karen's words tumbled out, laced with fury and disbelief. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Melissa responded. "Karen, I'm not sure that's how it went down. I mean, I get it, you were in pain, but slapping a nurse? That's a big deal. And you know how hospitals are. They have to prioritize their patients. There could have been someone in a worse condition. Maybe she was just doing her job." "No," Karen snapped, her frustration mounting. "You don't get it. I was ignored, humiliated, and I'm the one who's in pain. They're all so concerned with their little critical cases that they completely forgot about me. You don't understand what it's like to be treated like you don't matter. Melissa sighed deeply. Karen, I get it. But this doesn't sound like the best way to handle it. You're lucky they didn't call the cops on you. I know it sucks, but maybe try to cool down a bit. You're just making things worse by getting more upset. Karen wanted to argue, to scream, but instead, she just let out an exhausted breath. The adrenaline from the confrontation in the ER was starting to wear off, and a more profound feeling of humiliation began to creep in. Had she overreacted? Maybe she had. But that didn't make her anger any less real. She felt betrayed by a system that was supposed to help people, and her sense of justice had clouded her ability to see the bigger picture. She had wanted attention, wanted someone to acknowledge her pain, to validate her experience, but now, she was standing alone outside the hospital, with nothing but her own thoughts and the cold night air. Yeah, I guess you're right, Karen muttered into the phone, her voice quieter now, tinged with regret. I didn't think it would go like this. I just wanted to be heard. Melissa softened her tone. I know, Karen. But next time, maybe try to see things from their side. They're doing the best they can with limited resources. It's not all about you, you know? Karen hung up the phone, her mind still racing. Melissa's words, though well-meaning, felt like a hollow echo in her ears. What did she know about the pain Karen had endured? What did anyone know? As she stood there in the cold, her foot throbbing with pain, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow been cheated. That the world didn't understand how deeply her experience mattered. She had been mistreated, and no one seemed to care. Meanwhile, back inside the hospital, the atmosphere had returned to its chaotic norm. Rachel, who had been the target of Karen's ire, was already back to work, her focus unwavering. She had moved past the incident as if it had never happened, her attention consumed by the real emergencies around her. The child who had been brought in earlier was now stable, thanks to the team's quick action. But Rachel didn't dwell on the drama with Karen. She couldn't afford to. In her line of work, there were always more patients to care for, more lives to save, and no time for distractions. The staff around her had continued with their duties, aware of what had occurred, but there was no room for gossip or judgment. It was a hospital. There were people suffering, and every second mattered. The security officer who had escorted Karen out exchanged a few brief words with Rachel before returning to his post, ensuring that no more disturbances would arise. As Karen walked away from the hospital, her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, regret, and confusion. She had never imagined that her desire to be heard would lead to such an outcome. Her foot still hurt, but the emotional toll of the confrontation had left a deeper wound. What would she do now? How could she make things right? Could she even fix what had just happened? For now, all she could do was walk away, a frustrated figure in the darkened streets, still searching for the attention and recognition that she felt had been denied her. But in her heart, she knew that the world, the real world, would not stop to cater to her whims. And that realization was harder to swallow than any pain in her toe ever could be. As Karen trudged away from the hospital, her head spinning with a mix of anger and embarrassment, she couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind. Every detail seemed to burn deeper into her memory, her arrival at the emergency room, the pain in her toe, the overwhelming sense of being ignored, the slap, and then the ultimate humiliation of being escorted out by security. The further she walked, the colder the air seemed to feel, the silence of the night pressing in on her like a heavy weight. The city around her moved at its usual pace, indifferent to the drama she had just lived through. She could still hear her own voice, shrill and filled with indignation, echoing in her ears, but now, it was tainted with a gnawing sense of regret. What had she done? Was it worth it? Had she gone too far? As the minutes ticked by, Karen's mind grew heavier with self-reflection. She had always prided herself on being strong, on standing up for what she thought was right, but now, standing on the cold sidewalk with her injury throbbing in the distance, she wondered if perhaps she had misunderstood the situation entirely. She had been so consumed with her own sense of justice, her desire to be acknowledged, that she had failed to see the bigger picture, the lives that were at stake in that very hospital. The child whose injuries had been so severe, whose life had been hanging in the balance, had she even thought about them? Had she considered that the nurse who walked past her was not just ignoring her, but was instead doing everything in her power to save someone else's life? Karen's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of her phone again. She pulled it from her pocket, still feeling the sting of the earlier conversation with Melissa. Her friend had been right, hadn't she? The truth hurt, but it was clear now that Karen's anger had been misplaced. The call was from her mother, and as much as Karen wanted to ignore it, she found herself answering anyway. She had no energy left for any more confrontations, but she knew she couldn't avoid this one. "Hi, Mom," Karen said, her voice quieter than usual, a far cry from the defensiveness that had fueled her earlier outburst. "Karen, are you okay?" Her mother's voice came through, laced with concern. "I heard what happened at the hospital. I was so worried when I didn't hear back from you." Karen took a deep breath, the weight of her mother's concern pressing down on her like a reminder of the values she had grown up with. Her mother had always taught her that kindness, understanding, and patience were virtues that should guide her in all things. "I'm fine, Mom," Karen replied, the words feeling hollow even as they left her lips. I just had a rough time at the hospital. You wouldn't believe what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I can't imagine, honey," her mother said gently. "But you sound upset. What happened exactly?" Karen hesitated for a moment, the weight of what she had done settling more heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't sure how to explain herself, or if there was even a way to justify her actions. "I went in because of my toe," Karen began, her voice faltering, "and I got really frustrated because no one was helping me right away. I slapped a nurse when she walked past me, and then they kicked me out." Her mother was silent for a long time, and Karen could almost feel the disappointment radiating from the phone. It was the kind of silence that always made Karen feel small, as though the world had shifted in a way she hadn't fully understood. "Karen," her mother finally said, her tone soft but firm, "I understand that you were in pain, but that was not the way to handle it. That nurse, she was probably doing everything she could to help the people who needed her. You've got to remember that the world doesn't revolve around us, and sometimes there are bigger problems than our own discomfort." Karen's stomach twisted as she absorbed her mother's words. She knew she was right. What had she been thinking? Her pain, while real, had never been as urgent or as important as someone else's life. The reality was, she had acted out of selfishness, consumed by the need for attention, and in doing so, she had not only made herself the center of the storm, but she had also trampled over the very people who were trying to do their jobs in the face of far greater challenges. As she walked aimlessly through the streets, her mother's words echoed in her mind. It was a sobering realization, and Karen found herself feeling a deep sense of shame, the kind that gnawed at her insides and made it hard to breathe. The further she walked, the more her anger had dissipated, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to swallow her whole. By the time she reached her apartment, Karen was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally as well. She felt drained, as though she had been caught up in a whirlwind of her own making, only to be left with nothing but the debris of her actions. She knew she had to face the consequences of what she had done, but a part of her was unsure of how to make amends. Could she apologize to the nurse? To the hospital staff? Was there even a way to repair the damage she had caused? Karen's phone buzzed again, and this time, it was an email from the hospital. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The subject line read, "Incident Report, Emergency Room, Karen Taylor." She swallowed hard, her palms clammy as she read through the email, her eyes scanning each word, each line. The message was professional, but it was clear that her behavior had been documented. There was mention of the slap, the disruption she caused, and the fact that she had been escorted out by security. The hospital had also stated that they would be reviewing the incident further, and that she was prohibited from returning without prior approval. Karen felt a lump form in her throat as she read the words. The full weight of the situation was crashing down on her now, and there was no denying it. She had crossed the line, and now there were consequences to face. The final paragraph of the email was the one that struck her the hardest. It read, "We understand that patients may experience frustration in an emergency setting, but we ask that all individuals respect the healthcare staff who are working tirelessly to provide care to those in need. We urge you to reflect on the importance of empathy and understanding in situations like these." Karen sat down on her couch, staring at the email for what felt like an eternity. The words seemed to mock her, to remind her of everything she had gotten wrong. She had acted impulsively, letting her emotions control her, and now she was left with nothing but the aftermath of her actions. As the night drew on, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of closure slowly creeping in, albeit reluctantly. She had made a mistake, and it was a mistake that could not easily be undone. But perhaps that was the point. Maybe this was the lesson she needed to learn, to stop seeing the world through the lens of her own pain and to start understanding that everyone has their own struggles, their own battles, and their own stories. And sometimes, those stories were far more important than the small frustrations that seemed so monumental at the time. In the end, Karen realized that while her anger had been real, so too had the opportunity for growth. It was time to step away from her pride, to make amends where possible, and to try, in whatever way she could, to be more empathetic and understanding in the future. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better, a chance to learn from her mistakes and to move forward with a deeper sense of humility. But for now, as Karen sat in the quiet of her apartment, she allowed herself one final moment of reflection before the reality of the situation fully settled in. She would have to face the consequences, but that was only part of the journey. The true challenge, she realized, would be learning from it and becoming someone better because of it.